Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jana Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. Every week here on Gardening Utah, we give you gardening inspiration and advice from experts across the state. We talk about all things vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. We make sure you stay in the know of all the tasks you need to accomplish every week in the garden. Thank you for listening. We hope that this show is something that you'll look forward to listening to every week. Episodes drop each weekend on Apple Podcasts, so make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we also air on the radio in Utah on KKAT 860 AM on Saturday and Sunday at 10 a.m. We aim to inform and inspire you as you work in the yard or while you're out and about shopping at nurseries and garden centers. There is so much going on in the garden this time of year, and this show is packed with so much information, so hang on for the ride. And like last week, this show will be a little different because like many places of work, our studios are closed due to coronavirus. So I'm recording this from my own studio this week. Now, here's what's coming up on today's show. It is packed with information. First of all, we had so much interest and questions messaged to us on our Instagram page, which is at Gardening Utah, after last week's episode, specifically about backyard chickens. So if you haven't listened to that episode yet, you can go back to episode 4 and listen all about the pros and cons of getting backyard chickens. But I did want to address a few of the commonly asked questions that were sent to us to our Instagram direct messages from listeners, just to make sure everyone's questions are taken care of. So in this episode, we'll be answering a few of those questions, and then we'll get into talking about gardening during a lockdown. It is April and seed sowing time. And in these extraordinary times, we're all confined to our home, minus the essential trips that some of us need to take. And many of us are worried about access to fresh produce, as some of our recent trips to the store showed us some bare supermarket shelves. And that, quite frankly, makes you realize the responsibility of feeding our families is more than a trip to the store. So with interest in self-sufficiency that keeps coming up all over the place, we'll get into some easy things you can do at home to get your garden growing, whether you have an acre or just a balcony. We'll also get into a checklist of tasks that you need to accomplish in the garden this week. And if we have time in the last segment, we'll talk about gardening with kids and a few really fun ideas that you can do this Easter weekend or anytime outdoors when you've got to keep those kiddos entertained and not cooped up inside the house. So there's a lot for this week's episode, and we hope to inspire you. So sit back, watch those spring buds unfurl, enjoy the birds and the butterflies at this time of renewal and hope. But first, the tip of the week.
860 KKAT with your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
Whether you have seeds that you've nurtured yourself and grown indoors or brand new plants that you've bought from the local nursery, quite often those plants need a helping hand in order to grow well outdoors. So here's how to harden off your vulnerable vegetables, fruits, and flowers. If you're new to starting your own seeds or you've just purchased sprouts in your store, you may think that since the tiny plants have grown a few inches and sprouted a few leaves, you can just put them from their sheltered spot indoors right to outside in your garden. We've all been there and done that, but don't jump too quickly from planting from a container to the garden shovel, because those too early plants rushed into the ground are kind of like a toddler just learning to walk. They haven't learned all the ins and outs of the delicate dance from hand-holding to full steam ahead. So seedlings are tender and they've been sheltered their whole life. Think about it. They have been indoors, so they haven't experienced, direct sunshine. They also haven't experienced wind. So like a toddler, those newborn plants need an extra step in their growing cycle. So in order to transition them successfully from inside to outside, they need a little loving care, and that is what is called hardening off. So basically, hardening off describes slowly exposing newly grown vegetables, fruits, and flowers to the elements, changing temperatures, varying levels of sunlight and wind to enable healthy growth. And while it doesn't take a ton of time, it does involve some vigilance and a few steps. So first off, number 1 is to make sure that you start hardening them off before the seedlings' frost dates are up. So you want to get a little bit of a step ahead. So for example, if you're about to plant tomatoes that have only been indoors, you're going to want to start about a week before you're going to get those in the ground, which most often in Utah is about mid-May. Then you're going to want to Choose a hardening off spot that the seedlings will get some protection from wind and sun in their first couple hours outside. You have a couple options, including a shady spot against your home, a table under a tree, or inside a cold frame. And then put your seeds outside for about an hour in the mid to late afternoon. Now, move them to a hardening off spot for just an hour or two, and then make sure the plants aren't getting bashed around by the wind and that they're protected from pests, like not going to get stepped on by the dog or any animals. And then move your plants back indoors. And at the end of that first day's hardening off time, put them back inside. And if they're in a cold frame, close and secure the opening. And then each day, leave your seedlings outside for an hour or more than the previous day, gradually giving them more and more direct sunlight at a time. And at the same time, you can move them to a less sheltered location, so further away from the house where they might experience a little bit more wind or a little bit more direct sun, for example. And then protect them as needed. If the temperatures are going to dip, if it's going to, rain really hard or snow that day, then don't do it at all. Just take your time. But if the temperatures dip during the hardening off time, you need to bring them back inside or into the cold frame or wherever you're growing them. And just make sure that you do this gradually and protect your seedlings as needed. This will ensure that the investment and time you've already made in planting these plants will make sure that when they get out in the garden, they're strong, they can protect themselves from the wind, and they won't get burned by the sun, and we will have our happy, happy plants.
And that was the tip of the week.
So let's get into two questions we got a lot from listeners on our Instagram page at Gardening Utah after last week's episode on backyard chickens. The number one question that I got from most of you that I didn't address in that particular show was, why do so many people who have backyard chickens have their eggs on the counter? Well, it's actually a myth that you need to refrigerate eggs. Now, eggs that you buy from the store, you absolutely need to refrigerate. But eggs that come from your freshly laid backyard hens do not need to be refrigerated. And now there's two different kinds of backyard chicken people, those that refrigerate their eggs and those that don't. And in my case, I do not. So every time a chicken lays an egg, it comes with a protective layer called a bloom. Now this bloom keeps the bacteria from the outside world from getting into the egg. That bloom is washed off in the stores or before it gets to the stores. So it doesn't have the protective layer. So you definitely need to refrigerate store-bought eggs. You do not need to refrigerate homegrown eggs, but you definitely do need to wash them before you make breakfast, if you will, or do whatever cooking you're going to do. So you can leave them on the counter for 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes even longer, but you definitely need to give them a good wash before you eat them. So when we come back, we're going to get into more questions from our last episode on backyard chickens, and then we're going to talk about gardening during a lockdown. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jenna Francis on 860 KKAT. Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden. Here's Jenna Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. If you're just joining us, we are answering some questions that arose from our backyard chicken episode from last week. And then after that, we're going to get into gardening during a lockdown, and we will also be discussing all the tasks that you need to accomplish in the garden this week. So the second question that I got a lot of from last week's episode on our Instagram page at Gardening Utah, we just send us a direct message with your questions. I answer every one. So one of the main questions was, can you do an episode on how to raise chicks? Because the reality is raising chicks is very different than maintaining, chickens. So it's a very different game, and it is a lot of work to raise chicks. And as I mentioned in last week's episode, people really are flocking, no pun intended, to the places where you can buy backyard chicks like IFA and other places. And they are, is in many parts of the nation, panic buying because of the need to want to become a little bit more self-sustainable. And so my advice, if you've never raised chicks before, although it is fun and although it's timed because of Easter, if you're already dedicated to getting backyard chickens and you want that experience, if I get a lot of demand, maybe I will do a full episode on raising chicks because it is a different ballgame. But I know for sure with all of this panic buying that pretty soon, maybe it's going to be 4 weeks from now, 6 weeks from now, 8 weeks from now, that there will be a lot of people all over Utah and all over the nation that will be wondering, okay, what did I get myself into? And maybe they didn't listen to last week's episode on backyard chickens that gave the pros and cons of having backyard chickens. But there are going to be a plethora of ways to find hens that people have already raised from chicks. So, some of the places that I've seen and even got some of my own, because I'm one of those people that if I see an animal in need, I'm just like, I must fix this problem. And I've adopted a few chickens myself and added them to my flock, which is that's another episode of this show. But that being said, Facebook is a great place to find people who are needing to find and rehome some of their hens. There's different groups. So like there's Utah backyard chicken owners and, I'm probably not saying the name exact, but you can, if you search through Facebook, in a lot of the Facebook groups, you will see places where people are saying, hey, I've got, 6 or 7 chicks that are almost hens and I have too many or whatever it is. So I promise you that will be easy to find in 6 to 8 weeks from now and even further on into the year, because summer is a tough time to have chickens because it's really tough to keep chickens cool in the summer. That being said, there's other places you can look. Obviously, unfortunately, the Humane Society, there are, sometimes chickens that pop up there, which they're not meant to be on cement ever. So it's really hard when you see that. As well as KSL.com, they do allow you to post animals. You can't do that on Facebook Marketplace. So that's why you kind of need to look for Facebook groups in relation to chicken owning that have chickens that can be rehomed. So that's my number one tip right now. If you've never raised chicks and don't want to go there and only want to buy the equipment you need to have chickens, then get ready for your chickens, get your coop going, get your backyard ready and all set. And then start looking for some hens that someone else has raised on their dime. And you'll be able to, get eggs and, sooner than later. So usually it's like if you're getting egg or chickens this time of year, quite often you will have eggs by perhaps September, October, November. It's usually between 18 and 23 weeks old, depending on the breed of the chicken when you get the first egg. So, okay, so that was the last main question that a lot of people were asking from the last episode. And I just wanted to button that up a little bit. But again, anytime you're listening to our show, please communicate with us on Instagram at Gardening Utah. I love to answer your questions. I love to know what it is that you'd like in future episodes. And also guests, if you're listening to this and you're a nursery owner or you own a really cool garden company or anything like that you think, I want to be on that show, hit me up on our Instagram and we'll have a chat and see what that would look like. Okay, so now, next segment of the show, let's get talking about gardening during a lockdown. And what I mean by lockdown is all of us have a little bit of a different situation. Some of us can leave the home, some of us can't. Some of us are comfortable going to the store right now, and some are not. So I'm kind of giving maybe a bit of a worst case scenario is if you're really locked down at home and you need to take advantage of whatever it is you have on hand in order to be a little bit more self-sufficient. So, we're all stuck at home right now, whether we like it or not. And whether we like it or not, nature's marching on without us. And in a way, I love this time of year because even without what's going on in the world right now going on, nature gives us hope and it gives us renewal. And if you've got a garden, it's really the time of year to get out, enjoy it, and more importantly, make that garden help you becoming a little bit more self-sufficient. So if you're looking out where you live, unless you've already, established a place where you're gardening and have a spot to garden, you may wonder where you can plant and just to get something started, if you've never had a garden. Or maybe you're looking out at your lawn and some of it looks a little sad right now and into the summer. Maybe it doesn't get good enough water in that certain area, or it's kind of got a lot of crabgrass or whatever. And maybe you can dig up a certain part of your lawn or turf and make that raised bed you've always thought about. Raised beds are an amazing way to start a garden. One of the things I love about raised beds, and I'm hoping, by the way, to get a guest on in a future episode coming up soon about talking about raised beds and kind of giving us some resources. But with raised beds, one thing I love about them is you can manipulate the soil however you want. You can bring in topsoil, half topsoil and half compost, and really create an amazing soil without having to dig into the soil that's already there. And, you don't have to bend over as much. And gardening can be pretty hard on your back, let's be honest. So being able to go and pick tomatoes or pull carrots or whatever it is you put in your raised bed, it's a lot easier when you're not having to bend over as much because raised beds are higher off the ground. So there's a lot of benefits to raised beds. And one of the things I would say as well is that they're really great for quick crops like radishes, rocket lettuces, which is arugula, and, salads and, different types of lettuces and spinach. But they're also really great for root crops like carrots and beets, because with this, if you're able to manipulate the soil and make it really great, airy soil, then your carrots are going to be, more evenly formed. They're going to look really cool. Not some of the weird concoctions that happen when you're digging in the dirt straight away. Some of the carrots that grow from unaerated dirt is pretty funny. And there's a lot of pretty interesting photos online about stuff like that. But anyway, that being said, raised beds I highly, highly suggest them. I have several. The one plant that I would not suggest planting in raised beds is any kind of a squash. They tend to need a lot of space. And in a raised bed, the way the plants work and kind of how the leaves grow just doesn't work so well in a raised bed. Some people have luck with it, but I just don't find that zucchinis or, any other type of like crookneck or pumpkins, maybe pumpkins would do okay, but I prefer not to plant any kind of squash or long growing crop in the raised beds, because you can really get a couple different rotations through the year in your raised beds, as far as, like I said, right now, planting the really quick crops that you can, have grow in the next little while and then harvest, and then plant some other longer growing things like carrots and beets and that kind of fun stuff. Anyway, if you don't have a place for a raised bed or you've never established any kind of a garden in your yard, I want to encourage you to try container gardening, whether it's a window box with herbs, or, taking your containers and maybe don't plant flowers in them this year, or, vegetables are beautiful in my opinion, and I think they make great container plants. So if you only have a balcony, you can start with lettuce right now. You can start with arugula, and you can start with herbs, chives, parsley, dill, cilantro. There's so many amazing things that you can plant in containers. So, gardening during a lockdown, let's work with what we have right now and, get those containers out and get them planted. And it's really, we've got the time now. We've got the time to keep them watered. We've got the time to get them planted. So let's take advantage of it. Now, that being said, if you're further north, you may need to hang on a bit longer. But as always, this time of year, it's really important for gardeners to keep an eye on that weather forecast. Because even though it's nice and warm during the day, you can still get that snap frost at night. And that can really put a damper on your growing plans and be a growing pain. No pun intended. It's the second one in this show, at least that I acknowledged. Anyway, so April is a really changeable month. It's one of my favorite months of the year because there's so much renewal, so much hope. It's beautiful with blossoms and the first flowers coming out, but the temperature really can vary a ton. So you've got to be careful. In fact, I was noticing, like today, for example, when I'm recording this podcast, I'm looking out on my beautiful, yard and garden, and I was noticing, what a beautiful day today is. It's gorgeous. But I was noticing on my Facebook memories that 2 years ago today, I was clipping daffodils through a freshly fallen snow that had taken out all of the daffodils, all the tulips, and just laid them straight flat. So anyway, that just shows you how volatile the weather can be in Utah this time of year. And like everyone says, if you don't like the weather in Utah, wait 5 minutes. Anyway, so when you're gardening during a lockdown, there's other interesting things that you can do with regard to seed. And I have had some questions on our Instagram page on how long, and, for example, I have some really old seeds. Are they going to be able to germinate? And that really depends. But there's a better rate of germination by at least trying than just leaving them in the package. So can you use old seeds? It really depends on how they've been stored. So if they've been stored in a dry place and away from high heat, then definitely give it a go. See what happens. Some seeds keep for 2 to 3 years, like spinach, chards. Tomato seeds tend to keep very well. And I'm going to be honest with you, I found a packet of tomato seeds in sort of a photo album book that was kind of a gift in a card, and they were from 1999. And last year I planted some, and I got about 50% germination. Now, again, they were in a dry place away from heat. They weren't in like a garage or anything, and they actually grew. So give it a go. I mean, the worst thing you can do is not try, and you're really not out anything other than the time. So, you try up those old seeds. There's no better time than now to really, give them a chance to grow and see what happens. And there's also a few things in your spice cabinet that you may not realize you can sprout. And when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about that. Stay with us.
860 KKAT with Jenna Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time.
Savvy moms everywhere are shopping at Steals.com, a trusted daily deal shopping website for moms, babies, and kids. At Steals.com, quantities are limited, so act fast. Steals.com has an amazing selection, all at prices up to 70% off. Steals.com.
She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jenna Francis on 860 KKAT.
Welcome back, my garden friends, to Gardening Utah. Right before the break, we were talking about gardening during a lockdown and how sometimes you just need to get resourceful and deal with what you have if you're unable to go to the store for whatever reason. And I mentioned that did you know that there are seeds in your spice cabinet that may sprout? So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. Did you know that you could sprout mustard seeds? If you've got a little jar of mustard seeds, they may germinate very well. It's worth giving it a go, especially if you have a large jar and don't use the spice very often. You may be able to sprout mustard seeds. You also may be able to sprout coriander seeds. Now, coriander seeds are used as a flavoring a lot, but it's actually the cilantro plant. So if you love cilantro, as I do, some people don't. They think it tastes like soap. But I have grown to love it over the years. Wow, me and my garden puns, grown to love it. But coriander seeds are cilantro. And now a lot of the the coriander seed in the store, they've actually been what's called steam cleaned. And so they may not germinate. And you can kind of tell. So steam cleaned coriander seeds are lighter because in nature, when you grow cilantro in your garden and it actually bolts, the seeds are a lot darker. And for whatever reason, we just like everything lighter. As far as like our eggs, we, prefer the white eggs instead of the tan eggs, or we just don't like the darker coriander seeds because I think it just comes across as like, well, if it's from the garden and it's darker, then we need to clean it and it needs to be cleaner. So anyway, that's kind of the mentality there. So they steam clean some of those coriander seeds to make them lighter. And if they are lighter, they will not germinate. So don't even try. But if they're darker, give it a go. I mean, if the seeds are just sitting there in your pantry, give it a shot. You can also, if you've got dill seeds, sometimes you have sesame seeds, believe it or not, sometimes those will grow. Fennel seeds. Fennel is actually an amazing plant and herb that is beautiful. It looks a lot like dill. Anise, and quite often poppy seeds will grow, as well as chia seeds. Now, if you've got one of those chia pets, it's basically the same thing. But I know that chia seeds have become a staple in a lot of our pantries in the last many years. But, Yeah, so a lot of these seeds, again, some of them have been steam cleaned so that they won't, so they're lighter and they may not germinate. And sometimes they have a pre-treatment so that they don't sprout in the event that they get wet. But essentially, it's worth a shot. Sometimes it's kind of a fun little, a little project with the kids. So here's a couple things that if you're really stretching, that you can turn into growing straight away from your produce section of your refrigerator. So scallions, the little bunching green onions. When you go to slice those, if you only slice about on the white section on the bottom where it has the roots, if you leave that intact and go up about an inch and a half, sometimes more, and cut it off there and use the tops for whatever. I mean, it's amazing in food. I use it every single day. And you take the bottom part and leave the roots intact and just put it in like a little glass. And then just add a little bit of water. Those scallions in the center will regrow, kind of like when an onion gets old and it starts to sprout that green from the top. That's exactly what will happen. So you can get a lot of regrowth from your scallions and keep using the sort of the green part over and over. That's a little known fact. As well as celery. If you keep the bottom part of the celery and, just kind of cut it off about an inch and a half up, but just keep that bottom part and just put it right on dirt, quite often it will root out and start to grow celery from the very middle of the plant. And if anything else, even if you don't get, some amazing stalks out of it, quite often you will still get the really great, the leaves of the celery are very flavorful in broth and in, chicken stock and those kinds of things. So it's definitely still usable if you don't get like a perfect celery plant. But it's kind of interesting that you can actually grow the celery straight from the base, as well as potatoes. You can do that as well. I don't necessarily suggest going with potatoes because the potatoes starts that you can buy in the stores are usually healthier for your garden long term because they've been kind of grown in an environment without any disease. And sometimes sprouting potatoes just from the store can add some disease to your garden. But you can give it a go, and quite often they will grow and those potatoes will grow into future seeds. And I remember my grandmother telling me once, this is kind of a random interesting thought I didn't plan on mentioning, but I remember her saying she grew up in the Depression and she had said sometimes people get greedy and they eat their future meal. And she meant that very thing. Just that you got to be careful on your potatoes and your onions and, you got to keep those starts because if you eat it all up, you don't have anything to grow with the next year. Kind of an interesting thought I think of as my grandma that mentioned that to me just very recently, passed last month. So she's heavy on my mind of late. So other things that you can grow straight from your pantry. Did you know that dried beans? Quite often, the beans that you get at the store that are dried can be great for sprouting or for even or shoots. So maybe they won't grow into full stage pods and reproduce into, an actual bean pod. It's kind of totally dependent on what country they're from. They might not be the same climate as us with different day lengths and temperatures. So they may not create pods, but they very well may likely sprout or create amazing shoots, kind of dependent on whether they've been treated, kind of like I mentioned with the spices as well. But have some fun, especially, we're in a lockdown. We've got to make use with what we have if we're not able to go to the store. I think us in Utah, we've been pretty blessed in comparison to some other states, especially from other countries. But these are just some kind of interesting things that you can do in your pantry that you don't often think of that can really kind of, again, be a fun project for the kids and sort of, stretch out what you've already have, just kind of using up what it is you're already, working with. And I tend to be that way. I'm quite a frugal human being, and I'm kind of one of those people where I try not to waste anything. So even if a project like this, like maybe the celery didn't work out that I plant, or heaven knows, a lot of us have tried the avocado from seed, or maybe even the pineapple. This is silly, but I love it. I love the look of citrus trees. I love it. I lived in San Francisco for 4 years. I put my husband through chiropractic school out there and fell in love with citrus trees because other than that, I've always lived in Utah. And I actually save a lot of the seeds from my lemons or grapefruit, and I sprout them and grow them right here in Utah. And you can just do it indoors, but they make beautiful indoor plants, believe it or not. So right after the break, after this, we'll review a full checklist of tasks you need to get rolling on right now in the garden. So stick with us and I'll give you the dirt.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. 860 KKAT with more of the fastest growing show on radio. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm Jana Francis, and I'm about to give you a pretty comprehensive April gardening checklist. I just love April. It's such a renewed and refreshed feeling. You can see all the buds on the trees and the shrubs unfurl and all the tulips and the daffodils and the forsythias in bloom. There's so many birds flying about. And you know what? If you're a gardener, like I'm sure you are, if you're listening this far into this show, it's cool enough to work in the garden. Nothing like the misery of trying to do projects outside in the heat of July and August. And you don't quite have the spring allergies just yet. Anyway, as far as your garden checklist, April is the perfect time to do the following. First of all, drain the snowblower gas and run it till it quits. A lot of people forget this step and just kind of leave their snowblower where it was, and then when it comes time to needing it again, you're in a pickle. But, I'm not going to lie. I'm really bummed about the situation right now that we're not able to ski. I am a massive skier. And in April, sometimes I miss some pretty critical weekends of gardening because I'm up in the mountains skiing. But this year, I'm going to take advantage, try to get ahead in the garden and get some projects done. And I'm going to make sure we take care of that snowblower. But again, like I said earlier in the episode, 2 years ago today, it snowed like crazy, but not enough to really need a snowblower. So it's safe to kind of do the maintenance on that and get it winterized and put away and taken care of. So let's talk about the lawn. If you haven't already aerated your lawn, now is definitely the time to do so, especially if you didn't have it done in the fall. If your lawn is new or it's less than 2 years old, there's no need to aerate. It's also a great time, if you didn't already do this in March, it's a great time to fertilize your lawn with a pre-emergent fertilizer to prevent those weed seeds from germinating. And then you'll want to repeat it again in 6 weeks if you had a difficult weed problem last year. And this is all, of course, if you don't try to go the organic route, which I'm sure we'll have an episode on in the future. And then it's also the time to fertilize the lawn with a regular fertilizer if you plan to seed your lawn or bare patches in your lawn if you didn't already do this in March. So also, if there is no rain, and since I'm no weather forecaster, I don't know what's headed our way. So you can water the lawn only if needed, if you need to water in that fertilizer. But make sure to, if you do that, to do it early in the day or at night. And it's not the time to start your sprinklers on a routine watering basis. In fact, many USU extension service experts and horticulturists say that you really don't want to start your regular watering process until after Memorial Day. But really have a look at your lawn and just, if again, I do have a patch on my lawn right now that's just getting really dry, but I'm going to kind of have a look at the weather and see is rain coming up. And if not, I'll give it a hand water, but I'm not going to get those sprinklers on a routine until later because really you want to get those roots down as deep as possible in the ground. And so that through the year, your lawn is healthier and doesn't need as much watering throughout the year. So again, water only if needed, especially, if you just need to water in the fertilizer, if it's not already going to rain, and do it early in the day or night. And then if you don't have a lawn yet, now is, you can lay sod pretty much anytime you can find it. If you can find sod, you can plant it. Again, it's going to be kind of rough in July and August in the real hot months in Utah. But if you can lay sod, if you can find sod, you can lay it. And then if you have a problem with spurge or crabgrass, now is the time to put some controls down if you haven't already done it. And then if you have any bare patches in your lawn and you did not use a pre-emergent fertilizer already, or you don't plan on using a pre-emergent, then you can seed those bare patches in your lawn. Just try to make sure that you're getting the seed of, if you've got a Kentucky bluegrass, use that. If you've got a fescue or a bonsai fescue or whatever breed of grass or, variety of grass you have, make sure to use that seed. But get those bare patches in your lawn, seeded up if you haven't already used a pre-emergent. As far as trees and shrubs go, it's a great time of year, the perfect time of year to fertilize them. And it's also a great time of year to plant trees and shrubs. Fall is also a perfect time, but spring, this is a really great time to get your trees and shrubs planted, and also a really great time to support your local garden center. I'll go over some tips about that in this climate in a minute. It's a great time to deep soak trees and shrubs if you feel like the rainfall in your area has been inadequate. So if you don't think that you've gotten enough, natural rainfall or snow melt for your trees and shrubs, it's the time to really give them a deep soak. It's also the time to spray fruit trees for, use fir loam. That's a great option there, but it's a great time to spray them for fungus and pests. And do this after the flowers have fallen off. So as far as plants, let's move on to plants. And like I mentioned in the tip of the day in this episode, it's the time to harden off any seedlings that you're ready to move outside. So again, move them to a cool place like a garage or, the patio, somewhere so that they can start to learn what wind and sunshine is in a really step-by-step basis, day by day, so that they get hardened off and they're able to be planted without getting any wind damage or sun damage. And then it's a great time to also fertilize those seedlings that you've started with either a root starter during or after transplant, or, a natural compost if you go that route as well. So other tasks that you can do just in general in the garden, of course, it's a great time to remove weeds. They're starting to pop up like crazy, and the earlier you get to the weeds, the better. I'm a little bit ahead this year because I'm like I said, I'm not skiing on my weekends, so I'm able to go out and really get some of those weeds up. And I do have kind of a lot of property, so it's tough to stay on top of. But my husband and I, our goal is to really get those weeds up this year when they first appear, because it really becomes a problem into May and June. And by July, forget it. They're just too deep rooted and they're really tough to get out. As far as plants go, it is the perfect time to plant perennials. Get out there and support your garden center too, because obviously you're going to need to buy them from somewhere. And in this climate, there's another garden pun. But really with what's going on right now, some of the garden centers are closed, but not all. Many are able to stay open because it just kind of depends on how well you can social distance outside. And as well as a lot of them you can call first and place your order with what is you want. And then they can put it in the back of your car when you arrive, or they can deliver them. And, like I mentioned, contactless pickup. There's a lot of ways that you can support your local garden center through such a trying time. And still, even if you want to go and walk around, it's still very safe to do so as long as you're protecting yourself and staying social distanced and, of course, washing your hands and all the things that they encourage us to do right now. But the best thing that I would suggest is check the website or Facebook page before you go, and or give them a call. And of course, everyone wants to help because everyone right now is really wanting to do anything they can to support you, as well as get the business that they need to keep going. All right, so as far as vegetables, it is definitely the time of year to anything that you've really started indoors. As I mentioned earlier, get those hardened off before you plant them outside. It is the perfect time to do a second planting. If you've already done your first planting of like lettuce and radish and they're kind of a couple weeks in, you can do another second planting. So you're kind of creating this, harvest where you've got them on the way every couple weeks. So you can do your second planting or your first planting. Let's be honest, some of us haven't gotten to it yet, and that's totally okay. It's the time. So as far as transplanting outside, you're really right now going to want to keep sticking to your cool season vegetables like lettuce, onions, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower. It is not the time to plant outdoors tomatoes, peppers, squash, or anything that is a warm weather crop, because we will have some of those cold nips that will come in over the night. And, you'll walk out and your whole investment's gone, whether you started them indoors, which is especially devastating, or whether you bought them at a garden center. And, a lot of the national garden centers right now do have tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers and zucchinis and squash. And it's just too early unless you have protective measures like a cold frame, a wall of water, or a greenhouse. If so, great, go for it. But right now, if you make an investment in those plants, you're going to have to baby them. You're going to have to bring them, maybe you have a place in the garage or somewhere to store them, but they need to be protected from the frost because, we're only looking at the first, second weekend in April here, and it's still too early to get those warm weather crops in the ground. So keep that in mind. I really get sad when people, put a big investment into those vegetables and then lose them. It's happened to me before because you get so excited, especially when we get teased by some of the beautiful weather we've had this week. I mean, today it was 70 degrees plus where I live. And that's just like, okay, it's on. Let's go. Let's get everything in the ground. I'm going to be early and way ahead of the game. But really, as it comes to gardening, patience is key. If you're patient, well, as far as vegetable gardening at least, and many other aspects of gardening, but patience is key. Really make sure that those warm weather vegetables don't go outside without protective measures until Mother's Day. And we may get lucky. We may not have a frost from the end of April to, or anytime into May, but we just don't know. And the Farmer's Almanac says very clearly that it can happen, and it's happened to me before, even last year. I actually got kind of cocky and excited, like I'm telling you guys right now. And I planted 2 tomatoes. I didn't risk the rest because I typically plant between 26 and 30 tomatoes. So I only planted 2, but I lost them both, and that was kind of a bummer. So that being said, be careful with those warm weather vegetables. But the cool weather vegetables can totally go out now, and it's just fine. And as far as planting outside, let me just give you a couple tips on what you can plant up until certain dates. So until May 1st, you can still plant crops like kohlrabi, lettuce, parsnips, potatoes. So you kind of have until May 1st to get your potatoes in. I know I'm going to do a round of those this year. Rhubarb, asparagus, cabbage, spinach, and turnips. So you have until May 1st to really get those in the ground. So there's still time. And then until May 15th, you can plant onions and peas up until May 15th. Until June 15th, you have to plant your carrots and like your endive. I've never actually tried endive, but I think I might give it a go this year because why not? I've never tried it, so I like to experiment. So you have until June 15th to get your carrots and endive into the ground. And until July 1st, you can plant cauliflower, parsley, and Swiss chard. And up until July 15th, you can plant beets and broccoli all the way through July 15th, which is pretty cool. And then radishes, of course. I love to always have kind of a smallish crop of radishes going. I like to plant radishes every 2 weeks because they're so fun to just have on hand. Believe it or not, they're really great roasted. Look up the recipe from Danny SEO. Danny SEO is this great roasted radish recipe that I never thought would be amazing. And it's amazing. Anyway, I love to have radishes in like tacos and that sort of thing. And you can plant radishes up until September 1st. So lots and lots of things you can do in the garden. And just to keep that garden growing and keep those crops coming on throughout the year. So that is some of your garden checklists for the month of April. I really hope that we're all inspired to get out there and grow. And it's kind of fun for me. That gardening is such a passion of mine, and so I love being able to kind of sit here for an hour and talk about what I love to do. So thank you so much for listening to Gardening Utah. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you were inspired, and I hope that you learned something new. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts like Stitcher or Spotify so that you never miss an episode. Look us up on Instagram. We're at Gardening Utah, and send us a message and tell us what you'd like to see and help us get the word out about this show. This show is a Cumulus Media production. Thank you to our producer, Lambo. We'll see you next week on Gardening Utah. And remember, grow big or go home.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.